Good morning. How's everybody doing? I should have taken the cat home last night because one of the things that I always do when I'm in hotels is I can't sleep. And so I think hotels should allow you to have a cat so it can make bread, put you to sleep when you're in a hotel room. But I'm very excited to be here at this conference. And yes, I've never been to Champaign. It is very flat. I live in the mountains. My house, just to give you a point of reference, I live at 7,000 feet. So I'm up in the mountains, so I feel like I'm very energized here right now because I'm at, what are you at, 700 feet here, perhaps? So I'm excited to be here. And thank you for the kind introduction and the wonderful dinner last night. As Stacy said, I work for a UCED, a University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. So at the UCED, I run the Research and Training Division, where we spend a lot of time thinking about employment. And I have about, 17 staff that work with me in my division. And one of the things that we focus on and explore is employment and how we do employment more effectively. A lot of my work over the years is centered around people with the most extensive support needs. So when I'm talking about some of the data that I'm going to show you here in a moment, it really centers around supporting people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, people with autism, people with multiple disabilities. So my work over the years has really been like, how do we make employment work for people with disabilities? And you all in this room know that employment is hard. Anybody who's been in this arena knows that it's really difficult to get people with disabilities jobs. So I'm going to kind of explore today how we do that. And I'm also going to explore whether or not we're doing what we should be doing and whether or not we're making the grade in terms of supporting people with disabilities in regard to employment. So before I start, I just have to kind of put this slide up here because every time I go to present somewhere, my wife is like, make sure your zipper's zipped up, make sure your pockets you don't have like a rabbit ear coming out of your pocket, and make sure you don't drink other people's coffee, because I've actually presented at conferences, and I'm glad I'm up on stage where I've grabbed somebody's coffee and started drinking it when I was presenting. So hopefully I'm not just comic relief up here, that I'm actually going to give you some information that you can think about in terms of promoting better quality employment outcomes for people with disabilities. So I'm going to be talking about whether or not we're making the grade, and I'm going to spare the suspense and just cut right to the chase in terms of what we're doing in terms of employment. This is what I think when we're talking about employment, and especially people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, that collectively, and if we start looking at the data about employment for people with disabilities, we're not making the mark. We're just barely passing. And we've been doing employment work for over 40 years, and I'm going to kind of explore what that employment work looks like. But for over 40 years, we've been talking about employment. And the employment rates for people with disabilities just seem to be flat. They're not changing, they're not shifting. So I sit and look at these data, and I spend a lot of time exploring specific data sets for people with disabilities. And what we're seeing is that things just aren't changing. And I give this grade, this D+ grade, in the aggregate, because I know there's a lot of really good work that's happening out there. I spend time in schools, and I see what teachers are working with and how hard it is to implement quality employment. I spend a lot of time with vocational rehabilitation counselors and community rehabilitation providers, and I see the good faith effort that folks are doing to improve employment outcomes. But we just aren't getting there. And I think it's really important to kind of explore why we're not getting there and start thinking about the ways we can change our practices and our supports for people with disabilities. So in order to kind of tell you or show you what's happening in terms of employment for people with disabilities, I'm going to explore data. And I'm sorry about that. A lot of people don't like to listen to data and don't like to have an exploration of data. But I need to really kind of explore what this data looks like. So it's never fun to review data, so this slide kind of shows like the time perception of minutes when you're exploring specific data sets, and I know it could get boring. But in order to justify this grade that I'm giving in regard to employment, I have to really get into these specific data sets and show you what's happening in terms of employment. So collecting data on individuals with disabilities or employment data on individuals with disabilities is no easy task. So I'm going to show you a couple data sets related to employment and how the federal government collects data on people with disabilities, and illustrate that when I'm talking about some of the history related to employment supports for people with disabilities. So there are two federal data sets that I'm going to show you. One is related to the current population survey. So the current population survey is tied to the US Census and the Bureau of Labor Statistics. You know, when we get those monthly job reports that come out every month and say like the unemployment rate's at 4.2%, or what is it, hovering around 3% right now, this is where this data comes from. It's from the current population survey. That's one of the oldest surveys that are out there, and this current population survey really centers around all people. But there is a disability component to this data set. And in the current population survey, they don't necessarily look at categorical disability. So with this specific data set, they're looking at individuals with a work limitation. So it's not looking at a categorical disability, it's looking at the broad range of disability. And the way they define employment for everybody is whether or not an individual worked at all for at least 1 hour during the reference week. So when they were surveyed, okay? The other data set, which is a newer data set, is the American Community Survey, or the ACS. This data is yearly data, and so it's a supplement to the United States Census, and they ask specific questions regarding employment. This specific data set looks at categorical disability. So there's 6 different disability categories that are tied to this specific data set. One of which is cognitive disabilities, physical disabilities, hearing disabilities, vision disabilities, so on and so forth. So with this data set, we can start distilling down by specific disability categories to see what's happening in terms of employment. These are the two bigger data sets. They give us a snapshot. They kind of give us an idea of what's happening in terms of employment. Now keep in mind there are 60 million people with a disability in the United States. So collecting this data is very difficult and very hard. And to make sense of it, it's very difficult and very hard. The other data set, which I think is more appropriate to the work that we're all doing in this room, is the RSA 911 data set. So this data set is required by or the RSA, the Rehabilitation Services Administration, requires state vocational rehabilitation agencies to collect these data. And these data are nationally representative. And we can look at data at the individual level, so we could look at case-specific information related to employment. It's longitudinal in nature, so we can look at what happens with individuals with disabilities at the application process. We can look at individuals with disabilities at the services process. So the data set that I'm going to show you here momentarily, I kind of broke down the data and looked at individuals who are just receiving customized employment and supported employment. So it really allows us to get a snapshot of what's happening. All of you in this room are probably working in supported employment or customized employment in some capacity, or are working with providers who are providing customized employment and supported employment. And this is really nice for researchers. It's a very large data set, and it's just there. So we can just request this data set and start looking at the data. There's roughly 34,000 cases per year, and then we can look at these data over time. So the data sets that I'm going to show you in regard to the RSA 911 data, I looked at 4 years and kind of got a snapshot of what's happening in terms of employment for people with disabilities. So 3 different data sets that I'm going to use to kind of illustrate why I think we're getting a D+, why we're just barely passing in terms of employment for individuals with the most significant disabilities. So just to give you a little bit of background and history on where we've been. Like I said, we've been doing this for 40 years. We've been thinking about how we support an individual with a disability to obtain and maintain employment. So early researchers, starting with Susan Hazazi in the early 1980s, started to play around, and keep in mind this is before the transition mandate, right? Transition mandate, 1990. Susan was really playing around or looking at like what predicts an employment outcome for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And to no surprise, she found that the biggest predictor of post-school success for these individuals is if they were employed prior to exiting school. So we know that employment during school is critical to supporting people with disabilities after school, because you learn those really important soft skills, you learn those hard skills, you learn the things that we all need to, all need to engage in. And I probably, like, if I did a quick little poll in this room, everybody in this room probably had a job before they were 18. I'm pretty sure of it, right? Most likely everybody had a job by the time they were 21. That's not the case for people with disabilities, and especially people with the most significant disabilities. Yet when they move into adult services, we expect them to have the skills necessary to maintain employment. So these early work experiences are really critical to helping individuals with disabilities maintain and create a work identity. It's something that we all go through. But unfortunately, people with disabilities are not often afforded the same luxury as you and I have in terms of employment. So Susan was really playing around with this idea. She was like, we gotta get people with disabilities jobs before they exit school. And we know that if we do that, those individuals will be more successful. Another really important thing happened in the early 1980s, and this is when we started to define supported employment. So supported employment was first defined in the Developmental Disabilities Act. And at this point, researchers were starting to think, like, how do we get people with disabilities out of congregate facilities, out of these environments that tend to segregate and cluster individuals with disabilities, where they're not working on any employment skill per se. So people started to think about, like, how do we do this? And one of the routes to employment is through supported employment, and I'll spend a little bit more time talking about supported employment here in just a minute. But if you look at these data in the early 1980s, and this data is from the current population survey, we see that people with disabilities or people with a work limitation are employed at less than 30%. So we're just not doing a really good job, or we weren't doing a really good job in the 1980s. Less than 30% employment. And keep in mind, these data don't look at the quality of the employment outcome. I mean, if you're working 1 hour a week, you're considered having a job, or the data set considers you having a job. It doesn't look at the quality of a job. So one of the things that concerns me about some of these data that we collect on employment is it's dichotomous data, meaning we just look at, like, does a person have a job? Yes or no. We don't look at those really important questions about, does the person actually like the job? How many hours is a person working per week? Right? Some of these really important foundational questions that we have to ask, that all of us ask about our careers and about our work. Do we really like doing what we're doing? Okay? Another really important shift happened in the 1980s, and you all have probably seen this graph or this chart. So in the early 1980s, Madeline Will, who was then the Assistant Secretary of Education, was really concerned about employment outcomes for people with disabilities, particularly transition-age individuals. Once again, this predates the transition mandate, right? This bridges model that she created. Really important model, because it really started people starting to think about, like, how do we do this? How do we support an individual with a disability in moving from school to employment? And so she conceptualized this bridges model, very simple model. And she said there's some individuals that won't need any specialized supports or services. They can just go through the process of employment, tap into the resources that are available to everybody, right? There is this certain population of students that can go and just have no specific services. And then she said there are other individuals that are going to need more targeted support. These individuals will need something to help them bridge that gap from high school to employment. So she was like, some individuals can tap into these time-limited supports. So she was conceptualizing and thinking about vocational rehabilitation as a time-limited support. So she's like, we have to provide or bridge that gap to employment. And then the third tier here is that Madeline was saying there are some individuals that need ongoing support. They'll need long-term supports in order to maintain employment. So these individuals would be the ones that are receiving services through your developmental disability agencies. And so right around this time, we were starting to develop the home and community-based waivers, or services waivers, that are offered through the DD agencies. So she was like, some people are gonna need this level, this specific level of support. So this model really became the framework for transition. And keep in mind, we didn't have the transition mandate at this point, but it really became the framework of transition. And she started this discussion about what we need to do in terms of employment for people with disabilities. I was fortunate enough, I was presenting at a conference several years ago in South Carolina, and Madeline Will was at the conference where I was presenting. And after I finished presenting, she and I went out and had a glass of wine. She's like, can you come have a drink with me, and let's talk about what you're presenting on. And she was just really concerned. She was like, I started this conversation 40 years ago, and things aren't changing. She was kind of tapping into the same thing that I'm talking about. Like, why aren't things moving? We have all these parts in place. We've conceptualized how to do this. We have awesome people that are doing awesome work, but these employment rates are just stagnant. They are not moving in an accelerating trend. They're just flatlined. So this bridges model, in my mind, was something that really started us thinking more clearly and succinctly about transition. Supported employment was codified in 1986. So now supported employment could be provided as a service to individuals receiving vocational rehabilitation, right? So before 86, state vocational rehabilitation agencies were not required to provide supported employment. 1986, it was added to the Rehabilitation Act as a specific service provision. Now, for those of you who are familiar with supported employment, it's really designed to support individuals who have the most complex support needs. So individuals where employment hasn't been traditionally available, right? These individuals need tailored supports in order to maintain employment. It was really designed to get people out of congregate settings, out of sheltered workshops and day programs. So prior to this, to 1986, individuals with the most significant disabilities were receiving services in these congregate settings. These congregate settings are still here. So many individuals with disabilities, particularly those with more significant disabilities, are still in these work settings. Now, one of the problems with these congregate facilities or these sheltered workshops is that once a person is in one of these settings, they never get out. So once a decision has been made to place somebody in a congregate type setting, that often becomes their placement for their lives. So supported employment was a game changer because it really said, you know what, we have to get people out of these specific settings and into applied settings. If you go back to like thinking about why we have these congregate settings, they're really tailored or tied to this medical model of disability, which really suggests that people have to demonstrate competencies or show that they're ready to work before we get them into a work setting. But what happens when you put a person in a congregate type setting into a segregate setting? They don't learn the skills that you need to work. They learn how to function within in this congregate setting. So they kind of defeat their purpose, right? People with disabilities never get out. Supported employment was designed to move people from congregate settings into more inclusive type settings for individuals with disabilities. So supported employment, in my mind, a game changer. I mean, it was just a really amazing model that really changed the way we think about supports and services, changed the way we think about employment for individuals with disabilities, changed the way we started interfacing with employers and engaging with employers. So 1986. So y'all know about the transition mandate, right? 1990 was the first transition mandate. It's an outcome-oriented process that's designed to help an individual with a disability move from school to post-secondary activities, including supported employment or integrated employment. In 2004, it was changed to a results-based scenario. You look at these data, once again, this is data from the current population survey, and we see that nothing's really shifting in terms of employment outcomes for individuals with disabilities. So here, this data we see like in 1990, when the transition mandate was enacted, we're still under 30% employment for individuals with disabilities. Fast forward to 2004, and we are actually seeing some declines in employment for people with disabilities. Nothing's changing, even though we're starting to develop policies, programs, and supports for people with disabilities. These data just seem to be flat. And in my mind, this is the D+ kind of scenario. In the early 2000s, something started to shift, and we started to see some changes in the way we think about employment. So supported employment has been around for 14 years, codified in 1986. 14 years later, we were starting to see that individuals with the most significant disabilities were not receiving supported employment. So even though supported employment was designed to support individuals with the most significant disabilities, these individuals, people who had those extensive support needs, were not receiving that service. So the Office of Disability Employment Policy issued a call for folks to develop some models to support individuals with the most significant disabilities. And this is when we first started to see the definition of customized employment emerge. In that call by the Office of Disability Employment Policy, they specifically defined customized employment. So if you all are familiar with customized employment is a strategy that's utilized to support individuals with the most significant disabilities. And it goes through several distinct phases. So unlike supported employment, which works off this assumption that we're going to compete for pre-existing jobs, we use a job coach to help an individual learn about his or her strengths, interests, and preferences. Then the job coach or the employment specialist provides that support through job development, maybe helps the individual apply for a specific job, and then provides ongoing support so they can maintain that job. Customized employment, on the other hand, works off this idea that we have to go through a discovery process. So the discovery process, and folks oftentimes debate what the difference is between discovery and assessment. The good folks who are really instrumental in implementing customized employment would say discovery is a no-fail approach to learning about a person with a disability strengths, interests, and needs. So discovery says everybody should work and everybody has the capacity to work. Our job is to discover how we're going to make that happen. So it goes through this discovery process, then we go through the customized job development process as well, where we're really spending time with employers, getting to know what works, and we're matching that to the individual with a disability. So the best way to think about customized employment, and the way we conceptualize customized employment, is that job didn't exist before I started talking to the employer. So I'm creating these positions for the employer. Now, I've spent the past 5 years thinking about customized employment and helping develop fidelity scales for customized employment. This is a really tough concept for folks to get and folks to understand, both from the employment specialist side or the transition teacher side, even for the employer. So I think part of the problem when we're seeing these poor employment rates and why we're not getting there, because this stuff is really complicated. It's really hard to do this work and to do it with fidelity. So customized employment is a very hard thing to do. I'm going to show you some other data here in a minute about what's happening in terms of customized employment. Only a handful of states are doing customized. Every state should be providing or allowing for a customized employment service, but only a handful of states are really implementing customized employment. I think Iowa is one of the states that's doing it well. Washington State is doing customized employment really well. Utah is kind of doing customized employment well. We're working through some of the bugs. But it's a really challenging, really hard thing to implement. And I think for those of you who are in the employment world, you've probably seen some of the issues related to customized employment and how hard it is to implement. But, we're starting to see a little uptick in employment outcomes through 2014 to 2022, and I attributed that to the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, because this act had a lot of really important provisions that I think, in my mind, are the game changers. These are the things that are going to change these outcomes for individuals with disabilities. So the first important change in the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act was the establishment of pre-employment transition services. I think this is the thing that's going to really change the way we engage transition professionals and students with disabilities. And right now it's underutilized. States are really having a hard time spending down their pre-employment transition dollars. So under the Rehabilitation Act, states are required to set aside 15% of their Title I funds for pre-employment transition services. I know in Utah and in other states, they can't spend it. They are kind of almost twiddling their thumbs about what to do with this money. So one of the solutions that I have in terms of improving employment outcomes at the transition level is to engage more with pre-ETS providers and really invite them to the table to help educators do some of the work that they can't do because they're overloaded by large classroom sizes. So if we can bring in pre-ETS providers, and I'll talk about this here momentarily, I think this is the game changer. The way we start thinking about employment, start creating those early experiences, we use pre-ETS providers to do that. Another really important provision in WIOA was placing priority on youth and young adults with disabilities who have the most significant disabilities, right? So under WIOA, states are required to set aside half of their supported employment allotment to youth and young adults with disabilities who have the most significant disabilities. WIOA recognizes that this is where we get it done. Like, we need to spend more time and resources at the transition level to improve these specific outcomes. Okay? WIOA, in the amendments to the Rehabilitation Act, also added customized employment as a service provision. So as of 2014, vocational rehabilitation is required to offer customized employment as a service provision. Okay? And finally, we defined what competitive integrated employment is. Prior to 2014, there was no federal definition or no common definition of what it meant to be employed. So prior to WIOA, people were saying a student with a disability is employed because they're working in a sheltered workshop and earning sub-minimum wage. Under WIOA, a person can only be considered competitively integrated and to be employed in a competitive setting if they're earning commensurate wages and benefits. So the same wages that people with disabilities people without disabilities would earn at working similar positions. And if the majority of people in that work and setting don't have a disability. So this right here, this idea of competitive integrated employment is really critical and is starting to change the way we're thinking about employment and what it means to be employed. When you're thinking about employment, it's not sub-minimum wage. It's wage employment. People are earning what other people earn. Okay? So let's shift over to this RSA data, because I think this data set is really the data set that provides a lot of insight on what's happening with individuals with the most significant disabilities, individuals who are receiving supported employment and customized employment. My colleagues and I at Utah State University reviewed the RSA data set from 2017 to 2020. We're in the process right now of adding the 2021 data set to our review. But we were really interested in what happens to people receiving supported employment and customized employment when they receive services through vocational rehabilitation. Now, once again, the awesome thing about this data set is it's a big data set. So we were able to look at 89,000 cases of individuals receiving either supported employment or customized employment, okay? One of the things that this data set allows us to do, state rehabilitation agencies are required to keep data on the type of jobs people with disabilities are obtaining at exit. So they use what is called the Standard Occupational Classification System to categorize specific jobs. Under the SOC codes, and the SOC code is used by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, there's 26 major categories. So they categorize jobs into 26 major categories, and then within those major categories, there are minor categories or specific positions within those major categories. So we were like, all right, let's start seeing where people with disabilities are working. People who are receiving customized employment and supported employment. And this didn't really surprise me when we started to distill down this data. Most people with disabilities work in fast food preparation. So I don't know if y'all have ever heard of the F jobs that we talk about in terms of employment. So this would be like fast food, folding, flowers, filth, right? These are things that we tend to stereotype and say that these are the only jobs that people with the most significant disabilities can do. Well, we started to see this emerge in the data set. These are the jobs that people in customized employment and supported employment are obtaining at exit. So roughly 24% of individuals with disabilities who are receiving either supported employment or customized employment are working in fast food preparation jobs, or fast food and service relating jobs. Okay? Office support was the second most common place where people with disabilities work. So roughly 21% of people who are receiving customized employment or supported employment are working in office type jobs. So doing order filling or filing, so on and so forth. So we're not sampling the full range of employment opportunities that are available to people with disabilities. And then finally, we found that individuals with disabilities are the third most common job according to the SOC code, was people with disabilities receiving supported employment and customized employment are working in building and groundskeeping, essentially janitors. So when we're thinking about customized employment, supported employment, we're preparing people for 3 different job categories. Over 2/3 of the people that are receiving supported employment and customized employment are in 3 broad occupational categories. So when I look at these data, this really suggests that as a whole, we have stereotypes about what people with disabilities can be doing in terms of work. Now, we also started to analyze the differences between supported employment and customized employment, and what we started to see is there's subtle differences in the type of work that people in customized employment and the people in supported employment get. People in customized employment have a broader range of employment outcomes compared to people in supported employment. And I think the reason why this is happening is because of the discovery process. It requires us to think differently about employment, that we're not just going to the jobs that are there, right? The standard jobs that we all tend to gravitate towards. These entry-level jobs that businesses have a hard time filling. If we go through the discovery process, we're thinking about these other options for people with disabilities and not just going after these F jobs for individuals with disabilities. The top 2 jobs, when we distilled it down, and we have the occupational categories, and then we looked at the top jobs for individuals with disabilities. Well, stock clerks and order fillers was the number 1 job. The second job was janitors and cleaners, and the third job was dishwashers. And we started to see a little dip in 2019, and you all probably know why we're seeing the dip in dishwashers, because things shut down, and we had a little pandemic that kind of affected employment outcomes for people with disabilities. But my guess is, we're looking at this data again, looking at 2021, my guess is dishwasher is going to pop back up, and be a little, that category will increase. So when I look at these data, I mean, I never want to diminish the importance of these jobs. And that's not what I'm saying. All I'm saying is that we're not sampling the full range of employment opportunities that are available to all of us, that we tend to stereotype and tend to create stereotypes about what type of work people with disabilities can do. Okay? Another thing that we saw, or that we wanted to look at, was wage data. So unlike the ACS or the CPS, where we're not looking at wage or hours worked or so on and so forth, we can do that with this RSA 911 data. So we looked at how much people are earning in terms of supported employment and customized employment. We found on average that people receiving supported employment services earned roughly $10.39 an hour. People in customized employment earned $14.16 an hour. And in both scenarios, customized employment and supported employment, these individuals were working roughly 20 hours a week. So there's some good outcomes here. People are doing some things. But when you compare it to what people without disabilities are earning, this is when we started to see some differences. So I pulled the data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics to see what the national average wage is for these specific occupations. And if we look at food preparation, individuals that are the national average wage for people working in food preparation is $14.16 an hour. The average wage for people in supported employment and customized employment who are working in food preparation is $9.48 an hour. This is problematic. So once again, I think this perpetuates stereotypes that we have against people with disabilities. And I don't know about you, but if I knew my peers working in the same job were earning, 40% more than I'm earning, I wouldn't be happy about it, right? So this data is very concerning to me, that we're not supporting and not preparing people, both from the employment side and the disability side, for the demands of employment. And finally, when we're looking at these data, I think these data are the ones that trouble me the most. And when we're thinking about employment and how we support people with the most significant disabilities. So we looked at what happens at exit. So under this RSA 911 data, an individual can either exit into competitive integrated employment or not, right? So we found that 31% of people who are receiving supported employment do not exit into competitive integrated employment. It's problematic. So even though people are receiving those services, 31% of people in supported employment aren't exiting into competitive integrated employment. 58%, nearly 60% of people receiving customized employment don't exit into competitive integrated employment. That's huge. So when you think about the services and the amount of money that we're putting into these systems to prepare people for employment, if this was any other industry, we would say it's broken. So I really want you to think about that for a minute. If this was any other industry and we're investing this much time and effort into supporting people with disabilities to help them maintain employment, and 58% of people aren't obtaining what they should be obtaining after receiving the service, any other industry would say something's wrong. Why are we investing this amount of money into something that, for whatever reason, isn't working, that we're just not getting those outcomes? And I don't think it's because the services don't work. I think supported employment has a ton of research that demonstrates its efficacy. Customized employment is emerging, right? We're starting to learn more and more about customized employment. So I would say customized employment is an emerging practice. It's not an evidence-based practice, but we're learning more and more about how to do it well. I think the issue is implementation. That folks need a significant amount of training in order to do this and do it well. But unfortunately, from a transition perspective, educators don't have the time to learn how to do this well. I don't know, when I was a teacher, I was a transition teacher that worked in a post-high program serving individuals 18 to 21 years old. And granted this was in Utah, we still have very large classroom sizes. I had 20 plus individuals with significant disabilities in my classroom. Maybe if I was lucky, 2 paraprofessionals that were part-time, right? So how do we do all this stuff if we don't have the supports and resources to make it work, right? So there's reasons why we're seeing some of these gaps. The final data set that I want to show you is what happens with individuals who are on home and community-based services waivers. So home and community-based services waivers, I don't know how many of you all are familiar with HCBS waivers, but they're really designed to get people out of institutional-like settings and into community-based settings. So they support things like residential settings, group homes, also day programs and employment programs for individuals with disabilities. These data are collected by the good folks in Boston at the Institute for Community Inclusion, and they look at what's happening with people who are utilizing these dollars. And this one just, every time I look at this data, I'm just like, wow. I scratch my head and be like, whoa, we're missing something here. So from an HCBS standpoint, only 20% of individuals, and you're looking at these 5 years, only 20% of individuals who are receiving HCBS services are in competitive integrated employment settings. 80% of people who are receiving HCBS services, this is aggregate data across the country, 80%, 78%, are in what we call facility-based work and facility-based non-work settings. So the facility-based work settings are things like sheltered workshops. Facility-based non-work settings are things like day programs where we're not working on any type of employment-related skill. So once again, I mean, these data just really reinforce this D+ grade that I'm giving folks. That we have these systems, we have these supports that are available to people with disabilities, but somehow we're missing the mark. And I wish I had a crystal ball to figure it out, but I don't. I have some ideas. What do you all think of this data? Is it surprising to you to see what's happening in terms of employment? Surprising? Raise your hand. Kind of, a little bit. I'm surprised by it. I think it's really just a wake-up call for me when I'm looking at how we support people with the most significant disabilities. So, why aren't they shifting? So I've spent a lot of time thinking about why these data don't shift and why they seem to be flatlined. I need to make sure I have enough time. Stacy, how long am I going?
8 or 9:45.
Oh, wow, I'm way behind. That's all right. So I will get through I will move more quickly then. So why aren't outcomes shifting? Well, first and foremost, when it comes to transition, and keep in mind, I've been doing a lot of work with school districts in Utah, and I'm spending time working with specifically 4 different districts to think about how we improve employment outcomes for individuals with disabilities. One of the things that I'm noticing and that I'm seeing in working with school districts is that we tend to be checking boxes. And this is something we've known forever. Paula Kohler said this back 10, 15 years ago, that when it comes to transition planning, we tend to check boxes instead of thinking about the bigger outcome for individuals with disabilities. This is an example of a goal that illustrates the checking the box. When we're thinking about employment, and this is an actual annual goal that I pulled from some of the data that we're collecting, there's nothing wrong with this employment goal, but it's behavioral in nature. It doesn't really tackle what we need to do in terms of supporting people with disabilities to obtain an employment outcome. So I don't want to diminish the importance of teaching people soft skills, but when we're thinking about employment, we need to do more than check a box and just develop arbitrary goals for employment. We have to have targeted goals, annual goals, that are cumulative, that move towards that post-secondary employment goal. And they need to build upon themselves. And they need to start with applied experiences, applied employment experiences for individuals with disabilities. So we need to move from just checking boxes and making sure that we're compliant with Indicator 13 and all the things that we're all worried about, to developing more substantive transition plans that move towards an actual employment goal. I also have been thinking about, or I've done some work with teachers to think about why things aren't working. What are some of the barriers that we're seeing in terms of transition? And I did a study back in 2014 where I interviewed or I surveyed teachers. Actually, this one I did a Delphi study where I asked teachers, transition teachers, I asked vocational rehabilitation counselors who have a transition caseload, and community rehabilitation providers about why they think transitions, or what some of the barriers are to transition. The first thing that they said is that students lack employment skills, right? To me, I was like, well, isn't that why we're here? Is to help support individuals to learn these really important applied employment skills. The second thing that they said is that there's a lack of meaningful on-the-job training and supports to students with disabilities prior to exiting school. So we're not giving students the opportunities to learn these really critical employment skills. There's a lack of established relationships with employers. And this is where my work is where I'm starting to concentrate some of my research efforts, is how we establish these relationships with employers. Because once again, if we don't learn how to work more effectively with employers, then we're going to continue having those F jobs, we're going to continue having those poor employment outcomes for individuals with disabilities. And finally, low expectation for employment. Across the board, everybody was saying there's just a low expectation for employment. It's not something that we expect for all students. For some, but not all. I followed up this survey and working with some districts in Utah, and I started to do some focus groups, and I did these last year. So fast forward, this was like 6 years later than from my first Delphi study that I did, but I found that here's some of the things that teachers were saying. That they have limited pre-service education on transition. So we're asking teachers to understand transition, to develop substantive transition plans and goals without the requisite education to do it. When I did my dissertation in 2004, I believe, this is what I was looking at. I was like, how are we preparing teachers to meet the demands of transition, to develop substantive transition plans, not procedurally compliant transition plans, substantive transition plans. So I looked at, I did a content analysis of all the state offices of education's licensing requirements. And then I also looked at the top 2 producing institutes of higher education in each state. And I asked folks to send me their syllabi so I can see what they're teaching in terms of transition. Guess how many classes people, or pre-service teachers, were getting on transition? Does anybody have an idea? It wasn't even a class. It was typically, it was like a class session in like a curriculum class or something. So they would spend a day or two learning about transition. Now, the stuff that we're asking teachers and providers to do is very complicated. You can't do it in a day or two. This is hard work. So this is one of the problems. One of the ways we can improve these outcomes is to provide more targeted training and technical assistance to teachers who are actually doing this hard work. Low expectations for employment. Once again, all the teachers that I'm working with or engaging with were just saying they're just low expectations. From the teacher standpoint, from the parent standpoint, from the student standpoint, from the practitioner standpoint, they're just this low expectation that people with disabilities aren't going to work. Lack of applied experiences. So teachers were saying, well, we're so overloaded that we cannot provide these applied experiences. It's really problematic. Lack of knowledge about the transition process. A lot of teachers that I've been working with were saying, I just don't understand the transition process. And these are secondary educators, because we didn't provide the training that needs to be provided for teachers. And then finally, lack of collaboration and communication with adult service providers. They're like, we don't communicate with adult service providers. And so we're starting to see these service gaps between like engaging with these adult service providers. Other things why employment is not shifting. We don't understand employment. How many in this room, well, if you're a teacher, became a teacher because you were like, I'm gonna work with employers? I didn't. You know, when I first started, when I was working in a transition program, I mean, I had to shoot from the hip most of the time about how to do employment. And I also did what, you know, when I was a teacher back in the 90s, I did what every other teacher was doing. And I rotated people through job sites, and I did the things that we still do today. I had no training on how to do employment. It wasn't until the past 10 years that I really started to think about how complex employment is and how we interface with employers and how important it is to interface with employers. And once again, teachers, secondary transition teachers, oftentimes don't have the time to do this. That's why I keep on going back to this idea of pre-employment transition services, is I think where we're gonna start making really positive changes in terms of supporting people with disabilities. So what I've learned, and I've done some studies with employers and engaged with employers, is and I did focus groups with employers about how we can work more effectively with them. And they're like, we only wanna work with people who have business acumen. So people who really understand business. And if you don't understand business, you don't understand the essential functions of business, how they work, that businesses, believe it or not, are designed to increase their bottom line, not designed for charity, right? We need to start talking like a business. We need to start engaging with businesses using this business acumen. That we have to be an effective communicator. So we have to explain processes of employment. So, you know, when you're working with employers and employers are making a decision to hire somebody, doesn't matter if you have a disability or not, employers make decisions about hiring based on perceived risk. Anybody who's an employer or have made hiring decisions, that's what we start thinking about. Who's gonna be the least risk here? Most qualified and least risk. Inherently, people with disabilities to employers seem like they're the most risky hires. So it's really important for transition professionals, employment specialists, to really learn about an individual's strengths, interests, and needs, match them clearly to the needs of the employer, and eliminate that risk. And it requires a lot of work to do this. It requires employment specialists, transition specialists to think a little bit differently about employment. We have to develop meaningful partnerships and understand employment laws and provisions. Lately, I've been really getting into this, geeking out about employment laws and provisions specifically related to fair labor, because in my work with school districts and even community rehabilitation providers, we don't understand fair labor and how it works, and what we should be doing in terms of internships, what we should be doing in terms of unpaid job training, even like what we call work for people with disabilities. You know, one of the things, I know I'm running out of time, but one of the things that I hear all the time is like, oh, my student is doing volunteer work at Walmart. And I'm like, you don't volunteer at Walmart, right? You volunteer at, you know, at a church or something along those lines. So just even changing the way we talk about employment. I know I'm out of time, so I want to just highlight a couple things on how we change. I've presented now on employment issues in probably 5 or 6 countries. And one of the things that I noticed that's a universal truth is expectations. Doesn't matter if I'm in India, doesn't matter if I'm in Vietnam, it doesn't matter if I'm in Norway. Expectations are low for people with disabilities when it comes to employment. Doesn't matter if I'm in the United States. Expectations are always low. So one of the primary things that we can do to improve employment outcomes for individuals with disabilities is to elevate the expectations for employment. And this starts early, right? We need to start telling parents and students that employment is the first service option for individuals with disabilities. And this has to start in elementary school. And I'm not being facetious. We need to have these conversations in elementary school, saying our end goal is employment, because employment leads to better quality of life for individuals with disabilities, hands down. And it leads to less isolation and segregation of people with disabilities. So my takeaway, as I'm ending, and I didn't get through all my slides, but my takeaway is elevate your expectations for employment. Work with parents, work with students, and say, this is what we're trying to do. We want to achieve competitive, integrated employment for all individuals with disabilities, not some, all. So I know I'm out of time, and I had like 10 different slides to get through, but I'm going to end with this. Henry Ford, if you always do what you've always done, then you're always going to get what you always get. Start making changes in the way we think about employment. Start providing those applied experiences to individuals with disabilities. Change the perception about employment. And I think some outcomes will start to shift if we can just collectively start saying, what are we doing? How can I change my daily practices to improve employment outcomes for individuals with disabilities? So, thank you for your time. There's my email and phone number if you ever need a chat.